All right, I think we will get going. All right, everyone. Today we have optimizing your build performance. My name is Dan Giordano. I will be emceeing and taking us through today, but for the most part, you'll be hearing the voice of Sam Bhagwat, our co-founder and chief strategy officer at Gatsby. And we have an awesome talk today all about performance and build performance. You want to slide over to the housekeeping slide, Sam? Housekeeping, just to let everyone know, we are recording this webinar. We'll send an email in the next 48 hours with that recording follow-up. And then questions, feel free to ask questions in the questions tab today on GoToWebinar. We'll get to those during the talk, after the talk, and then if anything actually is left unanswered in our window today, we'll be sure to get you an answer on Twitter. So we've been following up with a lot of our answers that we haven't been able to get to. It's been a great experience. So feel free to partake in that live Q&A. We also will have a couple polls in the middle of the talk, so please help us out and get those answered because it'll kind of help facilitate the rest of our webinar today. All right, Sam, next slide, we'll get to our quick ad about Gatsby. Gatsby is born in 2015. It's how modern development teams build amazing digital experiences. Gatsby is an open source framework with plugins and a cloud platform to help businesses build fast, secure, and beautiful websites. And today we're going to talk about static site generation, which is what Gatsby is really known for and how powerful it is on the end user performance side. We're going to talk about a lot what that has to do with the build side and how Sam's going to walk through how we can really optimize that. So take it away, Sam.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Great to be here with everyone today. I'm gonna kind of jump in here. So, just some kind of background here. So I love doing performance talks. I gave one on site performance at GatsbyConf, and sort of a background about performance. When you're doing performance work, there are two things that are necessary. You need to have a mental model of the problem, and you need to have a toolbox of tricks that you can kind of try. And this talk covers both aspects of that in terms of build performance. So the way that we're going to jump into this is that we're going to kind of start off with a overview of Gatsby's architecture and then talk about how builds work before we get into sort of build statistics and improving build performance. And then we'll kind of close out with some final notes. Oh, okay, so Gatsby's architecture, great. And it's kind of easiest, and you know, if you're newer to Gatsby, some of this may be new to you. If you're more familiar with Gatsby, this may be familiar, but I think it's important for all of us to kind of start on the same page about this. So a traditional CMS kind of setup architecture, right? And we're going to compare Gatsby's architecture there. So at request time, users, the client, right, requests a page from the app server, which hits then the DB. So there's kind of two trips, and then it returns to the app server, and then it returns a page to the user. All right, and so this is, you know, WordPress works this way, Drupal works this way, so on and so forth. Lots of things work this way. And then if you kind of contrast that to how Gatsby's architecture looks, you've got at build time, so actually you sort of have as the source of truth, right, your CMS or GitHub, maybe other data sources as well. And then at build time, you run a Gatsby build, and then you create a bunch of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, etc., which you then store on a CDN, content delivery network. And then, you know, at request time, the user you know, sends a request, and it hits the CDN, and which is fairly close to them, and then it sort of returns them a response without kind of needing to hit the underlying source of truth. It's just stored as HTML at the edge, right? And so to think about like why this architecture makes sense, this is a great quote from someone who runs an agency that does a lot of Gatsby websites, Brian Webster. So he says, we think of websites as a big event or a party, and visitors as our guests. And he says his point is not pre-building and assembling web pages at request time would be the equivalent of setting up your party when the guests arrive. And he's like, why would you do that on their time, right? And so there's a sense in which this architecture, where you've got sort of builds going on first, and then the user only needs to, then the user only kind of hits the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, the assets stored on the CDN. That's optimized for user performance, right? So, in order to do that, we need to run Gatsby builds, right? And what do builds do? Builds generate HTML from your code and data. Again, your Gatsby site is a set of HTML, CSS, JavaScript files. These files are derived from the underlying code and content. Whenever the code and content changes, those files need to change too. And if you're familiar with databases, you can think about your site, which is sort of an interesting crossover between types of engineering, but think about your site as like a materialized view of your code and data. If you're not a database person, that's totally fine. Okay, so how builds work, right? And now we're going to go into kind of two bits: types of builds and the build life cycle. So types of builds. So first off, there are three types of Gatsby builds. There are cold builds, which means Gatsby generates a cache every time it runs a build, and the cold build means that you don't have a cache for whatever reason. Maybe you have to blow away the cache. Warm builds means that the cache exists, and you've made some change in code. Perhaps one of your page templates changed. And a data build is a build with the cache is there, and there's a content change from your CMS. Great. And so typical frequency of these, looking at builds on Gatsby Cloud, we see that for every cold build that's run, there are 7 warm builds, and there are 29 data builds, which is great because warm builds and data builds, as you might expect, are faster than cold builds because you've already got a lot of things cached. And we'll get more into this later as well. Okay, and also just you'll see a lot of statistics as we go on, and we did a bunch of analysis on builds happening on Gatsby Cloud, and are surfacing this here kind of for the benefit of everyone to kind of see and benchmark against. But we'll get more into that as we go along. Okay, so life cycle of a build, and when I say life cycle, I kind of mean what happens from the time it starts until the time it's over, right? And there's basically 3 stages. There's init, there's bootstrap, and there's build. So that's when we source the code, then we source the content, analyze the site structure, then we generate the files from the code and content. And this is, oops, okay, it looks like I might be missing the far left of my screen here. I think we'll probably be fine. Okay, so init, great, we're starting to source the code, it's coming in, we're grabbing our dependencies, now we're sourcing data and kind of starting to analyze the site structure. Hey, we've got some schema in our CMS, we've pulled that in, we've done any transformations that we need to do. Now we start building the GraphQL schema and server. As you see during the develop process, right, you always have a GraphQL server running locally during develop process. It's the same when you're building. You've got the GraphQL server running. You have a bunch of nodes with relationships to each other that model your code and your content. And at the end of the bootstrap phase, we're preparing to run queries on those nodes. We're extracting those queries from the code. And now we start generating the files. We're running queries, we're processing images, and then we start doing kind of the meat of the work, which is building the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for all of your pages. Right? Each of your pages is a number of files. Great. Okay, so that's the life cycle of a build. We've kind of gone from nothing until now we have a finished Gatsby site, which is great, right? So that's how a build works. It's kind of
Sam,
magical.
right there, I'm going to stop you quick and just shoot a poll in.
Yep.
after we learned about what our builds are, kind of how long or what they composed of. The first one here we're going to launch is for cold build times. What do you consider acceptably fast? So this is from scratch, not having anything cached. And we have under 3 minutes, 3 minutes to 5, 5 minutes, 10, and 10 to 20. So we'll give you 30 seconds for that. All right, 5 more seconds there. All right, and then for data builds, we're going to ask the same question. So data builds are kind of the fastest, what we were talking about before. Let's say you need to change the title on a page or a quick content update to your Gatsby site. So what do you consider acceptably fast there? 30 seconds, a minute, 3 minutes, or 5? And we'll give about another 30 seconds and then we'll continue on. I'll give you the results at the end of our webinar today. All right, 5 more seconds. Some people are pretty lenient, but we'll be quicker than that. Come on. All right, sounds good. We will close this, and Sam, let's move on. You're muted, sorry. I messed you up.
Aha, sorry about that. And you guys can see me as well, right? I wasn't, okay,
Yep.
great. Okay, awesome. So it's really interesting, your results. I think the conclusion, everyone wants fast builds, whether they're cold builds, whether they're data builds. We all want kind of rapid feedback, and we want to be able to see the results of our the changes that we're making as soon as possible. I think part of the emails that went out, we had the XKCD comic, right? The famous code compiling one. Right? Nobody wants to be doing that unless you can do a sword fight while you are waiting.
Sword fight in the middle of the day sounds kind of fun, actually.
It does. I think that's one thing that went away during the pandemic. Less sword fights during the middle of the day. So build time, let's dive into the build time, some build time statistics. And this is data coming from Gatsby Cloud. So I think a couple notes about this data before we go in. Gatsby Cloud does do a lot of optimizations, some of which we'll be getting into later. So, it'd say like, these are good, sort of well representative of the types of builds that you'll sort of see on Gatsby Cloud. And there's kind of ways to optimize it further as well. Okay, so and this is also sort of like all builds on Gatsby Cloud, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. But we kind of there's sort of 3 ways of segmenting this data that I think is useful for this audience, right? Build type, number of pages in site, because that's one of the key drivers of build times, and stage of build. So you can see sort of the key drivers of what's causing where the time is being taken up. So let's start off with published times by build type, right? And so the typical, let's say 1,000 page site takes 7 minutes to do a cold publish. And so publish is both the build step and the deploy step, right? So add them both together. You've got to generate the files, and then you've got to sort of shove them all into the CDN. So 7 minutes for a cold publish, 5 minutes for a warm publish, and 3 minutes for a data publish. And so this is like we did an analysis of all the sites of all the builds and publishes happening on Gatsby Cloud over the last month. So how does site scaling affect your publish time? We've got some great data on this too. So if your site grows 10 times as large, 10 times as many pages, cold builds will take twice as long. Warm builds will take about 1.8x times as long, and data builds will take about 1.6x times as long. So, plus 100, so yeah, twice as long, 80% longer, 60% longer, right? And this is actually really good news. And the reason why it's really good news is that you can see the build times are scaling sublinearly, right? You can scale a site and the builds are sort of like staying somewhat manageable. Although obviously faster builds are better, right? So one of the things first, before we kind of jump more into kind of full builds and publishes, is a lot of times what you need right away isn't actually for your content to go live right away, but it's to get rapid feedback. So we recently rolled out a next gen content preview, faster, stable, more reliable, stable. So on Gatsby Cloud, you need sort of rapid feedback to see what changes look like on the page, and we added this sort of nice preview loader to show you sort of when your content is coming in. And we found that for data builds, right, for data changes, preview builds tended to be 4x faster than publishing, right? So if you're published, it was going to take a minute for the data to go live. You can see it in preview in about 15 seconds. And obviously we're working on making this even faster. But this is a way to get even more rapid feedback as you are in your CMS, or maybe your marketing folks are in their CMS. Okay, great. So we broke it down by site size. Now we're going to look at site stage, and we also broke it down by build type, right? And so these are sort of going down the y-axis. You can see all the kind of granular site stages that make up a Gatsby build process. Grouped into the phases of init, bootstrap, build, and then the deploy. You can kind of see here, this is cold builds. So for where you can see the bulk of the time is happening for cold builds in the bootstrap, the build, and then the deploy, right? You can see a couple of the a couple of these sort of long sticks, so to speak. I think that was how Ward Peters put it, one of the tech leads. Some of these long, you can see where they are as source transform nodes, create pages, generating images. And then, kind of moving on to warm builds, you see that the time in Bootstrap, sort of relative time in Bootstrap goes down. It more moves over to the build and deploy phase. And then in data builds, again, bulk of it's going in the build and deploy phase. Bulk of the time is going in the build and deploy phase for data builds. Again, good to kind of get a sense of like what's sort of normal for a build. Again, this is all builds on Gatsby Cloud. So pretty broad data set to compare your site to. Great. So this is what is normal, or what what the average across a lot of sites. But the key question, right, the thing that you probably spend a lot of time thinking about, or some time thinking about at least, is how do I improve my build speed? I think this is probably a good thing to note, right? Like, it's often the job of sort of like the tech lead to think about how do we reduce my CI pipeline time, because reducing your CI pipeline time just improves the productivity of your whole team, right? The less time people spend sword fencing and waiting for their build to complete, the faster iterations go, and everyone wants to be part of that team that just keeps sort of throwing PRs over the wall at each other, like rapidly reviewing them and getting them merged in, right? It's fun to be part of a team like that. It feels great, and that happens with this sort of rapid feedback cycle. So there's three kind of sections that we'll talk about here. First off is some kind of recent build performance improvements we've made in Gatsby. Then we'll kind of move on to strong optimizations that we strongly recommend, also other optimizations. Okay, so Recent build performance improvements that we've made in Gatsby. So first off, Webpack caching is now persistent in v3.8. That just released, I think yesterday or I think yesterday. It might have been last week. Create page and query running improvements were in v3.5. We do some faster JavaScript bundling, v3.3. Webpack 5 and incremental builds in v3.0 was the big one, and that was back in March at GatsbyConf. So we upgraded from Webpack 4 to Webpack 5, and we put incremental builds in open source. Each of these is, you kind of like attacks kind of a specific stage or two of the process, right? Webpack caching is, when we're bundling the CSS and JavaScript. So there's also, we're also sort of constantly making build performance optimizations in Gatsby Cloud and Gatsby Cloud Hosting. Some things we do, preserving code and dependencies between builds, parallelizing image processing, having kind of a specialized data update infrastructure, as well as optimizing the deployment pipeline. If you use Gatsby Cloud, kind of together with Gatsby Cloud Hosting, we see a lot of folks, when they're moving to Gatsby Cloud Hosting, actually like decrease their deployment time significantly. Great. Okay, so optimizations that we kind of strongly recommend, and also just heads up, we did publish a page of documentation about a month ago, I believe, that covers a lot of these as well. So after this is over, you can watch the video again, but you can also read the documentation, share either or both with your team, whatever makes the most sense. Okay, so strongly recommended optimizations. These are things that will almost certainly, if you haven't done them already, kind of improve your build speed, noticeably. So upgrading Gatsby and source plugins, right? Because take advantage of these optimizations. Upgrade Gatsby. Excuse me. Upgrade Node. So this is one that maybe doesn't come to mind, but Node is getting more performant as time goes on, and Gatsby builds are a Node process. So it's actually kind of interesting. I was diving through some of the Node performance benchmarks for like v12 versus v14 versus v16. You should upgrade Node. You might get you'll get some build perf benefits from that. And then lastly, use Gatsby Cloud builds and hosting to kind of take advantage of the things we mentioned earlier, and we'll kind of dive into some of them a little bit more as well. So these are, again, 3 strongly recommended optimizations. If you sort of take nothing else away from this talk, do these 3 things, this will help. Great. There are also other optimizations. So these optimizations, sometimes they affect a specific build stage. So again, it's useful to benchmark your builds, your cold versus warm versus data, to kind of see where the time is being spent, so that you can see not much point in optimizing something that for you isn't a huge proportion of the build, right? These also these will make a big difference for some sites. They may not make a big difference for every site. So that's why we're calling them other optimizations. So first off, optimize bundle size for common templates, right? This is the building JavaScript and CSS phase, which which is one of the larger build stages by time. This is really interesting, right? So this is actually something we recommend from a performance standpoint. The less JavaScript you're sending to the client, the faster your site is. But it's actually also helpful from a build standpoint as well, right? Because the less JavaScript you're bundling, the less work that that the build process has to do, and the faster the build will happen. So you kind of knock off 2 birds with 1 stone here. And okay, so so using more CPUs, if you can control the instance type, that your site's being built on. You know, if you have the sort of, you can choose like, I think it's C1 rather than M1 on AWS or whatever, but like, you know, the larger your instance type in terms of CPUs, the faster your build is going to be, because builds are primarily, though not completely CPU bound. I mean, there are things that are IO bound, but generally they're pretty responsive to more CPUs. And on Gatsby Cloud, you can upgrade to the performance tier or the enterprise tier for sort of more CPUs as well. So when you're doing builds, just don't clear the cache between builds. So it used to be that Gatsby's cache was sort of less reliable than it is now. And so a practice that people kind of evolved was to clear the cache between their builds, which would mean they always got cold builds. Gatsby's cache is pretty darn reliable now, so don't clear the cache. And again, warm builds are faster than cold builds, so don't clear the cache. So you can audit Gatsby config for unused plugins. You know, sometimes you add a plugin and maybe it's not super useful, and then you forget to remove it. We've all been there. You know, you may want to just take a look back and see what you're using. Kind of similar for GraphQL queries. Maybe there's some code in your Gatsby Node.js file. Maybe some of your queries are pulling models that you don't need. You just kind of brought it in, but you actually realized you needed a different model or something, but you didn't remove the old model. So just like kind of like gently kind of go through some of your queries and go through your Gatsby node file and just make sure that you're using, and go through your Gatsby config file, make sure you're using all of the code that you have there. Okay, excluding unused content models or moving them to a different space. So sometimes it's the case that your sort of particular content space in, let's say, Contentful is using content that's for some different purpose than your Gatsby site. Well, the way that we pull in content, we're actually sourcing all the content in a particular space. For example, if you're using Contentful. So if you move the content that's not being used for your Gatsby site to a different space, you can save some of the time on source and transform nodes. Now, every source plugin kind of handles this a little bit differently. Like on WordPress, you can just sort of like specifically like exclude some of the models and the model names if you don't want a particular content model coming in. So you'll have to like look a little bit about how your source plugin works there. And you know, sometimes this isn't possible as well. Maybe there's some content interrelationships, but is like a good thing to take a look at. Okay, so parallelized image processing. So if you find that image processing is a large proportion of your builds, I'm not going to go back to the build time by stage breakdown, but you'll notice that on Gatsby Clouds, the source and the image transformation is not a very large proportion of overall build time. It's maybe 5 or 10%, and that's because we do a ton of parallelized image processing. So if you're on a host that isn't doing that, you may want to consider moving to Gatsby Cloud. And if you know image processing is a big part of your build times, you may want to consider moving to Gatsby Cloud for faster build times on that step. And then last thing is optimizing the breakpoints on Gatsby plugin image. You know, again, if image generation is a big thing, Gatsby plugin image has defaults about how many breakpoints it's going to generate, right? How many thumbnails you want for a particular image. And so you could decide that like, oh, hey, like actually I want fewer images, right? Or maybe smaller images. And if you reduce the number of image thumbnails that Gatsby plugin image is generating, that'll take less time, right? Because you're doing less work. Okay, great. So these are a great list of sort of other optimizations, and optimize bundle size, use more CPUs, don't clear the cache, audit Gatsby config, etc. Exclude unused content models, move to Gatsby Cloud for image processing and optimize breakpoints on Gatsby plugin image. But if you still need to optimize more, there are some other things you could do. These things kind of maybe take more time, or so that's why we kind of put them in the third bucket, right? It's one idea is to split your site into multiple sites. Doing this based on locale is the typical one that like folks who do this will use. It's a very natural place to split your site. Hey, it's in 7 languages. So Daniel Wellington wrote a great blog post. Daniel Wellington's a jewelry, Scandinavian jewelry brand. They had a 20,000, I believe it was a 20,000 page site that that they split down to a number of 3,000 page sites. I think their build times went from like 20 minutes to 3 minutes, because they had like seven locales that they kind of broke it off on. And then you can also use MDX can be a pain point in terms of the parsing time for MDX. And so if that's taking a lot of time, consider just moving to Remark and using Markdown files. Not optimal. MDX has some nice syntax, but again, if MDX is a big headache as far as build times, consider moving to just to Gatsby's Remark parser with Markdown files. Okay, so that's kind of, again, that's a bucket of things. We've kind of gone through the conceptual, like, hey, how builds work, right? We've gone through now some concrete things you can do to optimize your builds, and there's more things too, right? Like normal code optimizations. If you find that like you're doing some quadratic thing in your Gatsby node process, you're running a loop inside your loop, maybe try to figure out and so that's taking a lot of time, maybe figure out how to not do that. It's there's but so that there may be sort of like a list of other things as well. But let's kind of move on to other considerations. So experimental flags, benchmarking, and kind of concierge are the 3 things that we're going to talk about here. First off, experimental flags, another thing to kind of take a look at. So there are always feature flags that we have for a variety of reasons, right? We're testing something out, we're making it available to the community to try out. We're not, these are experimental, we're not sure this is going to work for 100% of people yet. There may be edge cases that we're discovering along the way. But worth kind of enabling some of these, making sure your site still builds, enabling them. Preserve file download cache. So Gatsby downloads a lot of file. We can persist the cache between builds. This doesn't work for WordPress. Just sort of a caveat right now. Yeah. So parallel sourcing, again, like, we source in serial, we can instead source in parallel. So that can be useful if you're pulling from a number of content sources, like, hey, I've got a Contentful and also a WordPress, or a Contentful and a Shopify, right? Okay, and then LMDB store is pretty exciting. So this is a database that instead of kind of storing the store in memory, we're working on using a database to do this instead, which is going to both reduce memory footprint and increase build speed. So you can enable this one. Again, you can take a look at all of them over here, and stay tuned, because in the next few months, like, the LMDB store is kind of I would say a harbinger of what will be coming. We're going to be really pushing the envelope of what static site generator is, especially, and I think this will be really helpful, especially for larger site builds. So kind of stay tuned there. Then sort of like, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but just benchmark, right? If builds are a pain point for you, just like kind of like look at like where the pain is happening, and kind of also just compare to what's slow relative to a typical site of this size, and start looking for optimizations. We presented sort of the summary of all times on Gatsby Cloud, but it's definitely possible to get faster than that all sites on Gatsby Cloud aren't running the most recent version of Gatsby, right? They aren't, they aren't all in sort of the performance tier, et cetera. So they haven't done all sites haven't done those optimizations. So you can, you can get faster than the average, definitely, if you do optimizing, and sometimes significantly so. Great. Now, builds concierge. So if builds are mission critical for you or your team, we're definitely available as a, our team is definitely available to work with your team. We can do a detailed sort of build audit of your site and then kind of work together as we roll out changes to improve build speed to make sure that you're able to like use these, implement these, and help you kind of make any changes that will help sort of dramatically increase the build speed of your site. So you can reach out. There's a URL there that you can reach out if that's something that you are interested in looking at or considering. And then last part, if these kind of problems sound interesting, right? Please come join us. We're hiring a couple of roles right now, in particular that are relevant for builds. There's a staff eng role for the integrations and collaborations team, which works a lot on the preview build loader. There's an engineering manager role for the framework team, which is like really deep in all of open source Gatsby and specifically, and as well as kind of, and builds as well. And there's some other roles as well. Some front end, primarily front end engineering roles on the developer experience team, and a DevOps role as well on our infra team, helping keep all this running. Yeah, you can check out gatsbyjs.com/careers for that. And we're fully remote. So yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions. I haven't gotten a chance to kind of see them as they've been coming in.
There have been a ton of questions. Kyle's been doing an awesome job answering some of them, but I'll pull some out to just get answered in front of everyone, if that's cool with you.
Sounds great. Into it. Yeah, it's just super excited to talk about builds and let's jump right into the questions then.
Yeah, so we are using create page to generate the pages on our site. I read that incremental builds need to have GraphQL queries and page queries and not in Gatsby Node.js. So we're moving our queries out of Gatsby Node.js. Can we move these queries into a template component that create page uses, or do they need to go in regular components?
I believe you should be able to move them into a template component. Kyle, speak up if you have additional information there that's useful or relevant. But you should be able to use a regular. You should be able to use a template component for that.
Yeah, it's whatever you. It's just the page component. So either that's in source pages directly, or whatever you specify as the page component when you're calling create page. That's where the GraphQL query needs to be.
All right, cold builds. How long, cold builds, warm builds to cache, how long does that last? Like how long will warm build last if you haven't maybe touched your build server in a while? Is that going to persist indefinitely? Is there going to be a limit for that?
It should persist indefinitely. Yeah, I mean, into some additional kind of context, we skipped a little bit over this. The things that'll cause your build cache to invalidate, you see this locally in development too. If you touch your Gatsby config, if you touch your Gatsby node file, we just have to kind of invalidate the whole thing. But if you're not touching Gatsby config or Gatsby node in your code, right, changing a template file or a component or maybe styling or whatever, your build cache should persist.
Perfect. We do have someone here actually that was just giving us their details on moving to Gatsby Cloud, and says we were around 15 to 20 minutes, and then they're around 1 minute for published builds now and 7 seconds for CMS preview builds, which is awesome. And we see something similar at GatsbyJS.com, right? We have probably around 7,000 pages at this point, and we consistently get 10 to 15 second CMS preview builds, which makes editing content super easy.
Well, that's it. Thanks for sharing. I mean, 15 minutes to 1 minute and 7 seconds, you know, is a pretty nice dramatic drastic improvement. So yeah.
All right, will you be switching Gatsby source Contentful to make use of their GraphQL API?
We'd considered doing that, but we don't have plans to do that right now. Benedict Roche, who used to work at Contentful, is doing a great job, sort of like adding a ton of incremental improvements, but it's very much based on the on their REST API. Okay.
All right, can we get a link to Daniel's post about Gatsby and multi-languages? That is in the presentation, but we can definitely send that out as well.
Yeah, and you can also just Google Daniel Wellington. Daniel Wellington is the brand name. It's not the person's name. I think there's a I'm forgetting his name, but there's a French engineer that worked on that site. But if you just Google Daniel Wellington Gatsby, you should find it. It's on the Gatsby blog.
Perfect. Is there a way to benefit from warm builds if your build servers are ephemeral, like when using AWS Amplify to build plus host your site?
Oh, 1 second, sorry, my son is just
No worries.
this webinar.
I can take this.
What's up, bud? Yeah, go for it, Kyle.
Yeah. So I mean, basically what you want to do is persist the .cache folder and public folder after builds, and then restore it at the start of the next builds. So most CI/CD servers actually use this kind of ephemeral build servers, but that's what they do, is that they kind of save out those files to like S3 and then pull them back in.
All right, another one actually that you answered, but this one was a good one, Kyle, and had to do with some of the webinar we did on our live stream. But how would you go about dynamically building a page where you don't know which data will come in? For example, a user might choose which sections a page has from a predefined set of sections, and like a CMS, let's say. We strongly recommend using GraphQL for various reasons, but with GraphQL, you need to define which data you get. Should you just use other means to get the data in this use case?
Or I guess
Go for it, Kyle.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, so GraphQL is a very flexible data structure. You know, having users specify kind of the order or which components are being used is not at all a problem. So this is what we do in gatsbyjs.com all over the place. And a lot of sites do this, and we had a previous webinar on this. But basically, your GraphQL query, what it looks like is you just query an array of kind of site sections, and so GraphQL doesn't know what the order is, but it just returns like an array, and then like you just look in your page component, you loop over each one, and then in it will have like the type. So the first one will be like, oh, this is type, you know, image gallery, and then you render the image gallery component with the provided data. The next one might be a quote, and then you render the quote component with, you know, the provided data. And so it works out really nicely, actually. We've been very pleased with it, as a lot of other people following the same sort of pattern.
All right, awesome. Another one actually in that kind of vein is, for build time, is it better to have one all contentful X static query in a frequently used component and risk a larger bundle size? Or is it better to have 120 contentful X page queries, or is there no difference?
Generally speaking, having separate page queries is best, because, you know, that's going to drive the best user experience, because each page, you know, you're only loading the exact data that's needed. Build speed should be comparable, because I mean, if you're the most of the work is in like for Contentful, for example, if you have markdown fields, most of the query time is just spent converting the markdown to HTML. Like the actual running the query part is extremely fast. Like we have a benchmark that, you know, runs queries, but like does basically no work at all, and it can do like thousands of queries per second. So breaking out data into, you know, separate page queries is almost always what you want to do.
All right, awesome. Do you think the choice of CSS framework has an impact on performances on build? I just stopped using Material UI because of slow performance, and I'm going to use Tailwind. Do we recommend that? Do we think that has an impact?
I'd say it can. Like the biggest impact is like React just gets the more components, the more complex the components, the deeper the component tree that you're rendering for on each page. Like it definitely impacts you know, the kind of pages built per second. You know, just looking at, you know, on Gatsby we have tons of different sites. So just looking across, you know, how fast sites built, there's a huge variance in pages, you know, how many pages per second like sites can build at. You know, some are going at like literally like 20, 30 pages per second, and there are others that can easily top like 800-900 pages per second. And that's a very, very, very big variance. It's like almost 2 orders of magnitude. Well, 1.5. Anyways, and so that makes a huge impact on your build speed, especially at scale. So anyway, so for small sites, if you don't have a lot of pages, Material UI is great. But if you have a bigger site, and especially if you're suffering with like slow build speed because of kind of SSR, kind of the how long it takes to create the pages, you know, that's a big part of your build, then it's worth optimizing for. But yeah, I would just look at, you know, look at any sort of build, and if it's not taking any more than like, you know, 15-20 seconds to do to build all your pages, then I won't worry about optimizing it. But if it's like minutes or more, you know, then definitely this is something that, you know, you can consider as moving to something really streamlined like Tailwind.
Okay, great. And then what page speed tool do you recommend to test Gatsby pages? We actually had a webinar on this, Sam and myself. We did one on some of the core web vitals and some of the tools that Google has, which I think we'd recommend a lot of the Google tools, and then also like web page speed tests. But do either of you have any other recommendations?
And that's, you know, in terms of site speed, those are the tools that we recommend.
Perfect. All right, someone just asked for polls too, Daniel. And actually, Daniel also asked about more sessions on build times, but a little bit more in depth. I think we definitely will keep broaching the subject. And also there will be obviously continued improvements to the framework itself and Gatsby Cloud to also work to shorten those up. And then there was another question around deployment time too, that everyone's always focused on build time and getting those shorter, but deploy times can take 1 or 2 minutes. Is there any work being done there? And I'd also just answer that too with, there will definitely be some, I think, big improvements in the next couple of weeks, couple months around that. We're doing a lot of work on the deployment times too, to make those match some of the speed times we're seeing on the build side. So propagation there should be much quicker in the future. And then so yeah, go for it, Sam.
Oh yeah, and I think it also like wasn't clear from the context whether like what platform what platform they were using, but you know, can kind of vary based on the platform you're using.
All right, so for cold builds, 26% of people wanted under 3 minutes, 48% wanted 3 to 5 minutes, 20% wanted 5 to 10 minutes, and 6% of you thought 10 to 20 minutes was acceptable. And then for data builds, obviously it was much shorter, but it's still super interesting to see because some of our CMS build, our preview builds are way quicker than this. But 50% thought 30 seconds or less was acceptable. Another 41% thought a minute, and then 6% 3 minutes and 3% 5 minutes. So obviously, definitely the data builds are shorter, but in reality they are as well, which is great.
Yeah, and you know, I don't know if folks are familiar with Brett Victor and in his work. He's someone that he he had a quote that sort of like rapid feedback is like just really helpful to creators of any type, right? When you're in local development, it's really helpful to like have your code open on one side and your your dev server open on the other side, and then your changes are kind of coming in and you're seeing how it affects the page that you're working on. Very similar to content. So I just like fast feedback and getting those times down. I just want to kind of like emphasize this is something we spend a ton of time thinking about, because rapid feedback cycles are really important whenever you're building something, whether that's code, content, etc.
Here's a quick one. Are all pages rebuilt on a data build, or just the pages which were affected by the change in the content?
Yeah, just the pages that are affected.
Yep. And then let's see. Sorry, there are a couple that we'll definitely get to that are longer answers. All right, we'll probably wrap it up here. But will MDX become faster in the future? Do you still recommend using it for new templates?
I can take that. So MDX V2, which is in beta right now, has a bunch of big speedups. Yeah, so I'm not clear when that should land, but that's something to look forward to. So yeah, MDX is great. I mean, MDX is always going to be more expensive than just straight Markdown, because MDX has kind of like full JavaScript in it, which is a lot more expensive to process than straight Markdown. But yeah, there's a lot of it's still relatively new as a paradigm, and there's a lot of optimizations that people kind of in the broader MDX community are working on. But yeah, but like always, before you pick a tool that you know could impact build time, do some kind of like test ahead of time. Like you can generate 10,000 MDX pages and see how long it takes to build, and if that will be acceptable or something, or whatever your project requires.
All right, awesome. And then the last question here, because it's softball. Thank you, Kevin. What are the benefits of Gatsby cloud builds versus building and deploying ourselves?
Do you want to start that off, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton. I mean, Gatsby Cloud is built specifically to make Gatsby builds and deploys as fast as possible. And so just in general, we do everything right that we can, and we're continually pushing both the framework and the cloud platform forward to improve that. So there's a lot of things, large and small, that we do really nicely. So like, we talked a lot about how important the Gatsby cache is to ensure fast builds. If you don't have the cache, some sites might take like 10 minutes or longer, and Gatsby Cloud includes that by default, and that can bring build speeds down to like 10, 15 seconds. And so anyway, so things like that make a massive impact. And I also think just like aligning yourself with us is really helpful too. Just that we're available to answer questions. We're gonna fix issues when they come up, and we're kind of like fully committed to making builds and deploys incredibly pleasant for people to use.
Yeah, and all of that, like there's just a ton of things that you'll see sort of expand over time. Right now we do image processing in parallel. There's other things that we can and will sort of parallelize in the future. We spend a lot of time thinking about, like Kyle said, how to make Gatsby Cloud the best place to build and deploy your Gatsby site and host your Gatsby site. So.
All right, awesome. Thank you both for joining us today, and thank you, audience, for coming on and listening to our discussion on optimizing your Gatsby builds. We'll be sure to send out the recording in a short time, so you can read this through, and then any links that we had there will be available as well. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your day.
Thanks for joining.